Meaning 12 Rules for Life, an antidote to chaos.
From alternative medicine salesmen to pseudo-intellectuals to religious apologists to politicians and political commentators, many public figures seeking greater power and popularity make use of the same dishonest tactics to manipulate their audiences into siding with and supporting them. Now, I'm sure that if you're the kind of person who watches videos like this one, you're probably already aware of several manipulation tactics, most of which are some sort of appeal to emotion. That's why I've decided to discuss more nuanced tactics here, which are commonly used today, but rarely unpacked. The tactics on this list aren't just used by career conmen and snake oil salesmen. They're also used by some people with actual credentials, sometimes as a primary method of persuasion, and sometimes just as a defense when they've been backed into a corner. Some of them can also be used somewhat unintentionally. I bring this up because, as you'll see, these tactics are easily identifiable in the work of Jordan Peterson. It just goes to show that someone being highly credentialed doesn't necessarily ensure that they're always honest in their means of persuasion. Creating a narrative and enemy. Humans love stories. We retain information much better when it's put in story form than when it's presented directly. The greatest teachers are nearly always the greatest storytellers, but so are the greatest tricksters. Regardless of your message, you'll captivate more people by telling stories to get your message across, and those people will likely remember what you have to say. It's a great and usually honest way to bring in an audience, but with a few extra pieces thrown in, it can become manipulative. Humans are an incredibly social species, and never do they achieve so much so quickly as when they bond together in a common tribe. If a storyteller has already captivated an audience, they can begin to involve their audience in the story by discussing how the story affects them and referring to them as a collective. This begins to give the audience a group identity. The audience can be united further and often even mobilized once the storyteller introduces one more element, the common enemy. If a problem is not only identified but actually given a personal identity, people are more likely to band together to fight it, and fairly often coming together as an audience to fight a common enemy entails supporting the person that told the audience about it. Let's take a look at how this plays out with an example. Alex Jones is adept at weaving, let's say, creative alternative narratives out of current events. Check out his take on the eventually successful push toward marriage equality in the US in 2015.
Now, the truth is there is a move at the UN, and it's nobody's business to be trying to target children with Heather has two mommies, or you can't say boy or girl because somebody may not identify as that. That is space cult, suicide cult, exterminism, craziness. The eugenics transhumanist cult wants to confuse the general species ahead of rendering us down and removing us. The decision has been made. Cheer up, the post-human era is dawning.
He's able to bring his audience into those narratives, giving them a place in his story. Usually, that's the role of an outraged community full of honest, regular people united to oppose a dangerous enemy. And how does Jones suggest his audience fight that enemy? Well, by buying products from his own store, of course.
We need to fund ourselves, and we fund ourselves by you buying the products. We're at a shortfall now because of the massive, sustained economic attacks we're under. But the listeners in just 2 weeks have almost narrowed that gap. I could have to sell my house to keep this place running 3-4 months. I could have sponsors every segment. I don't do it. I plug enough to fund things. Fund us. Give me the energy and I will attack the enemy.
Don't think that just because someone as radical as Alex Jones uses this technique, it's only used by radicals. Politicians on all sides reinforce us versus them narratives constantly, as do religious leaders of various faiths. But regardless of the speaker, manipulation is manipulation. The controversy bait and switch. Nothing grabs your attention like an unapologetic controversial statement. Getting a massive amount of bad publicity for making such a statement is so easy in the age of the internet that people everywhere do it by accident constantly. But what if you could gain publicity like that purposely and then turn much of it from bad to good? Well, that's what some public figures are successfully doing today. Here's how this process works. A public figure purposely makes a controversial, inflammatory statement, and the public reacts predictably by loudly and overwhelmingly giving their thoughts on the statement, which draws greater attention to the figure who made it. The figure then, with a greater audience than usual, not only clarifies their statement, which communicates their original message in a non-inflammatory way, but also emphasizes that they're being unnecessarily scrutinized by those who wish to undermine them for invalid reasons. There are three main effects of this approach. 1. The public figure gets to communicate their message to a larger audience. 2. The figure gets to paint their opposition as unreasonable or even malicious. And 3. The figure actually makes more enemies, giving their supporters someone to unite against, which means more dedicated support for the figure. Whether intentional or not, Jordan Peterson constantly pulls this off very successfully. Take his enforced monogamy statement. In an interview with the New York Times, Peterson encouraged the idea of what he called enforced monogamy. Now, the sound of that term, the way a layman would take it, is pretty jarring. The interviewer interpreted the term rather literally, thinking it meant legal and physical enforcement of monogamy, think Handmaid's Tale. The backlash against Peterson for using this term was huge, bringing a ton of attention to him then saying this.
I don't mean taking innocent women at gunpoint and handing them over to useless men, which is essentially the accusation. And it was really interesting to watch that unfold. What I meant was that monogamy as something that's socially valued appears to be essentially a human universal. And the enforcement is social norms. It's like, think about it. I can't believe that I even have to say this. So that's why, I'm a New York Times pariah, is because I think that monogamy, all things considered, is a good idea. It's like, okay, fine.
The interviewer missed Peterson's intention pretty badly, and Peterson comes out looking in a lot of ways better to many after this ordeal. Again, whether the instance of this tactic was intentional or not, I don't know, but it did undeniably bring him more attention and support, just like every other time people rally against him in a reactionary way.
I figured out how to monetize social justice warriors. If they let me speak, then I get to speak, and then more people support me on Patreon. It's like, that's annoying. It's like, goddamn capitalists make more money off this ideological warfare. It's like, okay, fine, let's go protest them. So they go protest me, and then that goes up on YouTube, and then my Patreon account goes way up.
The expert's GISH GALLOP. This one's a bit more straightforward. If you're speaking in front of thousands of people, especially as part of a debate, it's tough to get away with using blatant logical fallacies or dropping supposed facts that you can't back up if you don't disguise them. But if you can hide those flawed bits of rhetoric in plain sight, they might actually work in your favor. GISH galloping is a well-known debate technique in which a person overwhelms their opponent with as many arguments as possible in a short period of time. It's incredibly difficult to pick apart claims in a GISH gallop one by one, so many of them slip by even if they're invalid. Now, with a slight tweak, this technique can be used to give the illusion of overwhelming expertise on a particular issue inside or outside of a debate. That tweak is simply to quickly spurt out as many detailed facts about the topic at hand as possible. They need only be tangentially relevant because the point of reciting them is only to impress the audience with the speaker's expertise by overwhelming them. Here's another Jordan Peterson example. In his talk with Matt Dillahunty, Peterson claimed that people can't stop smoking without a supernatural experience, and that supernatural experiences that discourage smoking can be induced with psilocybin. So, psilocybin use aiding in smoking cessation is evidence for the supernatural. He eventually admitted that this wasn't definitive evidence for the supernatural, and went on to say this.
If you give people psilocybin, for example, and they have a mystical experience, not only are they much more likely to quit smoking, which is really something, but they're also much less likely to suffer from death anxiety if they have cancer. That's quite the thing. And not only that, if you test them a year later and they've had a mystical experience, which the majority of them regard as the most significant one, two, or three experiences of their life, including such things as getting married, their personalities are permanently altered in the direction of more openness to experience and more creativity by a standard deviation. That's walloping effects.
Laying out this information didn't change the argument from either side. In fact, it hardly affected the course of the conversation at all. This information given on top of the information on psilocybin that Peterson gave previously, some of which wasn't even correct, simply overwhelmed the audience with a sense of Peterson's credibility. It gained him some ground after he lost a bit in this part of the conversation. If you want to hear more about the lost ground I'm talking about, I do have a video about that, link in the description. The science sandwich. You've probably heard of tossing a word salad, creating a nearly unintelligible mixture of words. This is usually what critics call it when speakers are excruciatingly inarticulate, or worse, when they sprinkle complex terminology on top of their point in order to impress their audience. It's a kind of Trojan horse, influencing listeners to be more receptive of ideas because they superficially sound legitimate. Deepak Chopra is pretty famous for this.
Quantum leaps, for example, are examples of discontinuity. And creativity in consciousness is also an example of discontinuity. And that healing may be a biological phenomenon that relies on biological creativity. That at very fundamental levels it may be a discontinuous phenomenon. It's something unpredictable that happens in the proliferation of uncertainty.
What I call building a science sandwich is not unlike that, but it has some key differences. Tossing a word salad happens over the course of just a few sentences, whereas sandwiching can be done within a paragraph, but it's usually done across the course of several speeches or lectures. Speakers that practice sandwiching speak on 2 or more topics that earn them legitimacy. These are usually but not always scientific topics. They then speak on a less legitimate topic in the midst of the others, so that topic appears legitimate as well. Much like describing woo in scientific-sounding terms, this tactic is all about stealing the impression of legitimacy from where it's been earned to be utilized where it hasn't. Unfortunately, this can be seen across Jordan Peterson's various lectures. You are likely to hear him talk about and teach well-tested, reputable concepts in psychology. He's an accomplished clinical psychologist, after all.
Political conservatives tended to be low in trait openness, that's the creativity dimension, and high in trait conscientiousness. Whereas political liberals tended to be high in trait openness and low in conscientiousness. And so one of the things that's extraordinarily interesting to know from a Big Five perspective is that your political proclivities are very powerfully influenced by your temperament.
But you're just as likely to hear him teach on Jungian concepts which are largely unverified and not particularly reputable in the field of psychology today. He usually does this, mind you, in the same context, from the same classrooms and lecture halls, without making the distinction that certain concepts are scientific while others are not.
One of the most relevant practical reasons, as far as I'm concerned, is that integrating narratives, and so those would include political narratives, integrating narratives have their force because they draw on universal archetypes. Otherwise they wouldn't have any power, right? Because they're basically stories. Political stories derive their power from the underlying archetypal representations.
This is problematic because most people aren't educated enough on psychology to know the difference between analytical and experimental psychology and recognize that one is being taught to them as if it's the other. What should be made clear is that analytical psychology, like Jung's, does not follow the scientific method. Many of Jung's concepts, such as his model of the psyche, including his archetypes, have not been scientifically tested and verified because they're not scientifically testable in the first place. Peterson has done his fair share of legitimate scientific research, and a lot of his lectures on concepts within experimental psychology are great.
Well, I'm not interviewing the clinical literature, I'm interviewing you. What do you think?
Well, I'm a psychologist and a scientist, and I tend to base my opinions on what I've read in the broad, relevant clinical literature. I'm not making this stuff up. I studied antisocial behavior for like 15 years. I'm actually quite an expert on it.
But because of that, people think he's speaking in the same capacity and with the same credibility when he talks about unscientific Jungian ideas. The worst part of this is that many of the ideas that Peterson uses to motivate his audience to live and behave in certain ways are Jungian. These unverifiable ideas allow him to construct a narrative for his audience to fit into, which, like we discussed before, motivates many to rally in his support. When it comes right down to it, this is the same kind of tactic that less credentialed speakers use to manipulate their audiences. Thanks for watching. I've been Drew of Genetically Modified Skeptic. I finally have a Discord server, so you can go ahead and join that, link in the description, come hang out with me and with this guy who really wants to be in the video for some reason. Praise be unto Adam, my top patron and personal Lord and Savior, for making this video possible. Go ahead and subscribe, check out my Patreon, follow me on Twitter and Facebook at GMSkeptic, and until next time, stay skeptical. Say bye. You know, I've decided that I'm going to start calling you a Rottweiler, but I'm going to pull a Jordan Peterson and say that, you know, it's pretty complicated what Rottweiler means, but I still want to call you that, so that's what we're going to do. Yeah.